The morning sun broke through the ancient copper beech trees, casting shadows across perfectly manicured lawns that stretched as far as the eye could see. Peacocks wandered freely through gardens designed to rival Versailles, their calls echoing off stone walls that had stood for over a century. In the distance, a mansion rose from the landscape, like something transported from an English countryside dream. Red brick, tall chimneys, mullioned windows catching the light in a way that made the whole structure seem to glow. This was old Westbury Gardens on Long Island, one of the most beautiful estates in America. And behind its gates, a family called Phipps had built something that looked, from the outside, like perfect happiness, wealth beyond measure, gardens that took your breath away, a legacy that would last forever. But perfection, as it turns out, is expensive, not just in money, though there was plenty of that spent, but in other ways, quieter ways, ways that don't show up in architectural magazines or society pages. And the Phipps family, for all their brilliance and all their beauty and all their carefully tended gardens, paid a price that no amount of wealth could ever compensate for. The story begins not with tragedy, but with triumph, with a poor boy from Philadelphia who became one of the richest men in America through sheer determination and perfect timing. Henry Phipps was born in 1839 to a shoemaker father who struggled to feed his family. Young Henry grew up sharing a bedroom with his siblings in a tiny house where poverty was not just a condition, but a constant presence. He had almost no formal education. He worked from the time he could walk, and he became best friends with a neighbor boy named Andrew Carnegie. That friendship would change everything. When Carnegie started building his steel empire in the years after the Civil War, he brought Henry Phipps along as a partner, and Henry turned out to have a genius for numbers, for organization, for making the machinery of industry run smoothly. While Carnegie was the visionary, Phipps was the operator. He managed the finances. He negotiated the deals. He made sure the steel mills ran efficiently and profitably. P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, approximately 15 billion in today's money. Henry Phipps walked away with his share, $50 million, or roughly 1.5 billion adjusted for inflation. At 62 years old, Henry Phipps had become one of the wealthiest men in the world, and unlike Carnegie, who spent his later years giving money away and building libraries, Phipps wanted to build something else, something permanent, something beautiful, a place where his children and grandchildren could grow up surrounded by beauty and culture and refinement. A place that would prove once and for all that the poor shoemaker's son from Philadelphia had arrived. So in 1904, Henry purchased 200 acres of rolling farmland on Long Island in an area called Old Westbury, where New York's elite were building country estates. And he began to plan not just a house, but a complete world. An English-style manor house with over 60 rooms, gardens that would take a decade to perfect, stables for championship horses, greenhouses growing exotic plants, lakes and walking paths and hidden grottos. The whole estate would cost millions to build, adjusted for inflation, approximately $75 million. It would employ over 60 full-time staff just to maintain. It would be a monument, not just to wealth, but to taste, to culture, to the idea that money could buy not just comfort, but transcendence. But Henry Phipps himself never lived to see his dream completed. He died in 1930, just as the Great Depression was beginning to swallow the world he had known. The mansion and gardens passed to his children, particularly his son, John Schaffer Phipps, who took on the responsibility of maintaining his father's vision. And that word, responsibility, is important because what looked like a gift was actually a burden, a beautiful, crushing burden that would define and ultimately damage the lives of everyone who tried to carry it. If you're still here, you're here because you understand that the most beautiful things often hide the heaviest costs, that gardens this perfect require more than just money to maintain. And if that matters to you, that attention is what makes stories like this possible. John Schaffer. Phipps inherited not just the old Westbury estate, but the expectation that he would preserve it exactly as his father had intended. The mansion had to be maintained in pristine condition. The gardens had to be perfect. The family name had to be protected. And the operating costs were staggering, roughly $4 million per year in today's money. Property taxes alone consumed enormous amounts of capital. The staff of 60 needed salaries, housing, benefits. The gardens required constant attention from expert horticulturalists who knew how to maintain rare plantings from around the world. The mansion needed repairs, heating, cooling, cleaning. The stables needed upkeep. The greenhouses needed fuel and maintenance. John tried to meet these expectations. He truly did. He managed the estate carefully, invested the family fortune conservatively, and devoted his life to preserving what his father had built. But the world was changing rapidly around him. The Great Depression destroyed many family fortunes that had seemed untouchable. World War II brought rationing and labor shortages. The tax structure changed dramatically, with inheritance taxes and estate taxes climbing higher and higher throughout the mid 20th century. Suddenly, the kind of estate that the Phipps family maintained was becoming not just expensive, but nearly impossible to sustain. And there was another cost, a psychological cost that nobody talked about, because living in a mansion this grand, maintaining gardens this perfect, upholding a legacy this demanding, it leaves no room for anything else. No room for mistakes, no room for different dreams, no room to be anything other than the keeper of someone else's vision. John Schaffer Phipps spent his entire adult life maintaining his father's estate. He never built anything of his own. He never pursued his own dreams. His life became entirely about preservation, about holding on, about preventing decay. And slowly, quietly, that kind of life becomes a prison, even if the prison has 60 rooms and gardens that take your breath away. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of early 20th century design. The architect, George Crawley, had been brought over from England specifically to create something that would feel authentically British while still being suited to the American landscape. The red brick was imported from England. The woodwork inside was carved mahogany and oak. The grand staircase swept upward in a curve so elegant it seemed to defy gravity. There were libraries with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, ballrooms with crystal chandeliers, breakfast rooms with hand-painted wallpaper from France. Every detail was considered. Every material was the finest available. The house was designed to communicate one simple message. The Phipps family had not just wealth, but refinement, not just money, but culture. The gardens were even more ambitious. John's wife, Margarita Grace Phipps, took charge of their design and became obsessed with creating something that would rival the great gardens of Europe. She hired the best landscape architects. She traveled to England and France to study famous gardens and bring back ideas. She imported rare plants and trees from around the world. The result was spectacular, a walled Italian garden with geometric beds and classical statuary, an English-style boxwood garden with walking paths and hidden benches, a rose garden with over 200 varieties, a water lily pond that reflected the sky like a mirror. The gardens were not just beautiful, they were transcendent. People who visited described feeling like they had stepped out of time into some idealized past where everything was perfect and nothing ever changed. But that perfection required endless labor. A team of 12 gardeners worked full-time, year-round, to maintain the plantings. They pruned and weeded and replanted and fertilized. They protected delicate plants through harsh winters. They battled insects and diseases. They ensured that every hedge was trimmed to exactly the right height, that every flower bed bloomed in the proper sequence, that every lawn was mowed in perfect stripes. The work was skilled, demanding, and never-ending. And the gardeners, like the housekeepers and cooks and stable hands, were invisible. Their names don't appear in the family histories. Their wages were modest. They worked long hours in all weather. They made the perfection possible, but they were never part of the story. Before moving on, ask yourself, who really pays for beauty like this? Is it the family who writes the checks, or the workers whose labor makes the dream real, but whose names are forgotten? The invisible people at Old Westbury Gardens deserve more than a footnote, because without them, the mansion would have been just a building, the gardens would have been just dirt, the legacy would have been nothing. There was Margaret, the head housekeeper, who supervised a staff of 15 women responsible for cleaning 60 rooms, laundering linens, preparing meals for family and guests. There was Thomas, the head gardener, who had trained at Kew Gardens in England and spent 30 years of his life maintaining the Phipps estate. There were stable hands and chauffeurs and groundskeepers and kitchen staff. Most of them lived on the property in quarters that were comfortable but nowhere near as grand as the main house. Most of them worked 6 days a week. Most of them earned wages that were adequate but not generous. And all of them understood, without anyone needing to say it out loud, that their purpose was to be invisible, to appear only when needed, to make the lives of the family seem effortless. This was the social contract of the Gilded Age and its aftermath. The wealthy provided employment, the workers provided labor, and everyone pretended that this arrangement was natural, fair, permanent, but it wasn't fair. It never was, because the workers gave years of their lives, decades of their labor, to maintain someone else's dream. And when they grew old, when they could no longer work, they were retired with modest pensions if they were lucky, and nothing if they weren't. Their children did not inherit gardens. They inherited nothing but the memory of parents who had spent their lives serving the wealthy. If this made you pause, that pause matters, because these weren't just employees. They were human beings whose entire lives were shaped by the needs of a single family, whose dreams were postponed or abandoned entirely so that someone else's vision of perfection could be maintained. The financial mechanics of keeping Old Westbury Gardens running became increasingly complicated as the decades passed. The Phipps family fortune, while enormous, was not infinite, and it was not growing the way it had when Henry Phipps was actively investing in steel and railroads and real estate. By the second and third generation, the fortune had been divided among multiple heirs. The capital was being managed conservatively, generating steady returns but nothing spectacular, and the operating costs of the estate kept climbing. Wages increased, property taxes increased, maintenance costs increased, insurance costs increased. Heating fuel became more expensive. Everything became more expensive. John Schaffer Phipps found himself in a position that many heirs to great fortunes eventually face. He had inherited an asset that was technically worth millions, but actually cost millions to maintain. The estate had enormous value on paper, but it generated no income. It was purely a liability, a beautiful bleeding wound in the family's finances. He could have sold it, of course. The land alone was worth a fortune by the 1950s and 60s, as Long Island developed rapidly and real estate prices soared, but selling would have meant admitting defeat. It would have meant betraying his father's vision. It would have meant being the generation that let the legacy die, and John could not bring himself to do that. So he held on. He cut costs where he could. He reduced staff gradually over the years. He closed off sections of the mansion that weren't being used. He let some of the more elaborate garden features fall into disrepair. He sold off pieces of the original 200-acre property to raise capital. Slowly, incrementally, the estate began to shrink. Not enough that visitors would notice. The core remained spectacular, but enough that those who knew the property well could see the slow erosion, the gradual retreat from the original vision of perfection. And the psychological toll on John Schaffer Phipps was immense. He had spent his entire adult life trying to preserve something that was always slipping away. He had sacrificed his own ambitions, his own dreams to maintain his father's legacy. And despite all his efforts, despite all the money spent and all the years devoted, he was losing. The estate was in decline. The fortune was shrinking. The world was changing in ways that made properties like Old Westbury Gardens increasingly anachronistic. They were relics of an era that was gone, monuments to a social order that no longer existed. And John knew it. He could feel it, and it broke something inside him. His children watched this happen. They watched their father devote his life to a house and a garden. They watched him grow old, trying to hold back time, trying to prevent change, trying to keep everything exactly as it had been. And they learned a lesson that their grandfather probably never intended, that inheriting wealth can be a curse as much as a blessing, that being given a legacy can mean sacrificing your own life to preserve someone else's dream, that the beautiful mansion and the perfect gardens can become a prison if you let them define who you are. These stories take time, and support keeps them possible. If you believe that understanding the real cost of generational wealth matters, if you believe that history has something important to teach us, then that belief is what allows this work to continue. The 1960s brought a crisis point. John Schaffer Phipps was aging. The operating costs of old Westbury Gardens were becoming unsustainable. The property taxes alone were crushing, and the family faced a decision that had been looming for decades: sell everything and divide the proceeds, or find some way to preserve the estate for future generations. Selling would have been the financially rational choice. The land was worth millions. The art and furnishings inside the mansion were worth millions more. Liquidating everything would have given each family member a substantial inheritance, freed them from the burden of maintaining the property, and allowed them to pursue their own lives. But John couldn't do it. Even in his 70s, even exhausted and financially strained, he could not bring himself to be the generation that let his father's dream die. So instead, the family made a different choice. In 1959, they established the old Westbury Gardens Foundation and opened the estate to the public as a museum and garden. The mansion would be preserved exactly as it had been. The gardens would be maintained to the highest standards. But instead of being a private family home, it would become a public trust, supported by admission fees and donations and endowments. It was a solution of sorts. It saved the estate from being sold and developed. It preserved the beauty and the history. It allowed the public to experience something they otherwise never could have seen, but it also meant that the family home was no longer really a home. It became a performance, a museum piece, a carefully preserved snapshot of a vanished world. The family could no longer live there privately. Their private spaces became public exhibits. Their family history became public entertainment. The price of preservation was privacy, intimacy, the very qualities that make a house feel like a home. And even as a public institution, Old Westbury Gardens required enormous financial support. The foundation had to raise millions of dollars to maintain the property. The gardens still needed their staff of expert horticulturalists. The mansion still needed constant maintenance and climate control to protect the furnishings and artwork. Property taxes, while reduced because of the nonprofit status, were still substantial. The foundation operated on a thin margin, always fundraising, always conscious that one bad year could threaten the entire operation. The current state of Old Westbury Gardens is complex. On one level, it's a success story. The estate is beautifully maintained. Over 200,000 people visit each year, walking the gardens and touring the mansion. It's used for weddings and events and educational programs. It's considered one of the finest examples of a Gold Coast estate preserved for public benefit. Preservationists point to it as proof that these historical properties can be saved, that the past doesn't have to be bulldozed in the name of progress. But on another level, it's a monument to the unsustainability of extreme wealth, because the estate could not survive as a private home. It required transformation into a public institution supported by charitable donations and government tax breaks and admission fees. It required giving up its original purpose, being a family home, in order to continue existing at all. And even with all that support, the foundation struggles constantly with funding, with maintenance costs that never stop climbing, with the endless challenge of preserving buildings and gardens that were never designed to last this long or serve this purpose. The Phipps descendants mostly do not live at Old Westbury Gardens anymore. They moved on to other homes, other lives, other legacies. Some remained involved with the foundation, serving on boards, supporting fundraising efforts. But the daily burden of maintaining the estate, of preserving their great grandfather's dream, was eventually handed off to professional staff and volunteers and donors. The family was freed, in a sense, but what they were freed from was their own inheritance, their own history, and that freedom came with a cost: the loss of a family seat, a gathering place, a physical connection to their own past. If you're still here, it's because you understand that preservation is never simple, that saving something beautiful often means transforming it into something different, that the act of holding on sometimes requires letting go. The psychological impact on the Phipps family across generations is difficult to fully measure, but the patterns are clear. Henry Phipps, the patriarch, built the estate as a monument to his success, a way of proving that he had transcended his humble origins. John Schaffer Phipps, his son, inherited the burden of maintaining that monument and spent his life trying to preserve it, sacrificing his own ambitions in the process. And the next generation, John's children and grandchildren, largely chose to distance themselves from the estate, to build lives that were not defined by their family's legacy, to pursue careers and interests that had nothing to do with maintaining gardens or preserving mansions. This is a common pattern among families with inherited wealth. The first generation builds, the second generation maintains, and the third generation walks away. It's sometimes called the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves phenomenon, fortunes built and lost within 3 generations. But it's not always about losing money. Sometimes it's about losing the will to carry the burden. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the price of preserving a legacy is too high, that living for the past means sacrificing the present, that being the keeper of someone else's dream means never building your own. The servants and workers who made old Westbury Gardens possible have largely been forgotten. There are no memorials to them, no plaques with their names. The historical tours of the estate focus on the family, on the architecture, on the famous visitors who came to admire the gardens. But the people who did the actual work, who scrubbed the floors and trimmed the hedges and cooked the meals and polished the silver, they have disappeared from the story almost entirely. We know they existed, we know they were essential, but we don't know their struggles, their dreams, their frustrations, their joys. They were supporting characters in someone else's story, and when the story gets told and retold, the supporting characters are edited out. This erasure is not accidental. It's structural. It's built into the way we think about wealth and legacy and historical preservation. We preserve the mansions, but not the servants' quarters. We maintain the gardens, but not the gardeners' memories. We celebrate the families who owned these estates, but not the workers who made them function. And in doing so, we perpetuate a lie, the lie that these estates were somehow effortless, that they existed in a state of natural perfection, that the beauty just happened without sweat or toil or human cost. Before moving on, ask yourself, when we preserve historical estates like old Westbury Gardens, whose history are we actually preserving? The history of the wealthy family, or the history of the much larger number of people whose labor made that wealth visible? The financial structure of modern old Westbury Gardens reveals something important about the true cost of maintaining these estates. The foundation operates on an annual budget of approximately $4 million. That money comes from admission fees, event rentals, donations, endowment income, and grants. And that $4 million is barely enough. Major restoration projects require capital campaigns that raise millions more. The roof needs replacing every few decades. The plumbing and electrical systems require constant upgrades. The rare plants in the gardens need expert care. The furniture and artwork inside the mansion require climate-controlled storage and professional conservation. In other words, it takes $4 million per year, plus periodic multi-million-dollar capital campaigns, just to maintain an estate that a single family once occupied. And even with all that investment, the foundation struggles. One bad hurricane can cause millions in damage. One failed fundraising campaign can create a budget crisis. The preservation of old Westbury Gardens is not a one-time accomplishment. It's an ongoing battle against time, weather, decay, and the simple economic reality that old buildings and elaborate gardens are extremely expensive to maintain. This raises an uncomfortable question. Is this the best use of resources? $4 million per year could fund schools, hospitals, social services. It could provide housing for hundreds of families. It could support scientific research or environmental conservation or any number of causes that might have greater social benefit than maintaining one family's mansion and garden. The foundation would argue that the estate has cultural and educational value, that it provides beauty and inspiration to the public, that it preserves an important piece of history, and those arguments have merit, but they don't change the fundamental calculation. Preserving one estate in the style to which it was built requires enormous ongoing investment that necessarily comes at the expense of other potential uses of those resources. The Phipps family's relationship to their inherited wealth was complicated by the sheer visibility of that wealth. The mansion and gardens were not just assets. They were symbols. They were constantly on display, constantly being compared to other estates, constantly being judged. The family could not simply live there quietly. They had to maintain standards. They had to keep up appearances. They had to ensure that the estate reflected well on the family name. And that kind of pressure, that constant awareness of being watched and evaluated, takes a psychological toll. John Schaffer Phipps, in particular, seems to have felt this pressure acutely. He was, by all accounts, a conscientious man, devoted to his family and his responsibilities, but he also spent his entire adult life trying to live up to his father's impossible standards, trying to maintain something that was designed to demonstrate wealth and power, rather than to be a comfortable family home. He never complained publicly. He never spoke openly about the burden, but those close to him could see it. The way he aged prematurely, the way he worried constantly about money despite being a wealthy man, the way he could never quite relax or let go. His children watched this and drew their own conclusions. They saw what devotion to the family legacy had cost their father, and many of them chose a different path. They pursued careers in fields unrelated to the family business. They lived in homes that were comfortable but not palatial. They made choices that prioritized their own happiness and their own dreams over the preservation of a family image. And in doing so, they implicitly rejected the values that the old Westbury estate represented. The idea that family legacy is paramount, that preserving the past is worth any sacrifice, that the outward appearance of success matters more than inner peace. These stories take time, and support keeps them possible. If you value this kind of depth, if you believe that exploring the psychology of wealth and legacy matters, that understanding is what allows this work to continue. The transformation of Old Westbury Gardens from private estate to public institution was not just a practical solution to a financial problem. It was also a profound shift in meaning. The estate went from being a family's private sanctuary to being a performance of what wealth used to look like. And in becoming that exhibit, it lost something essential: the lived experience, the daily reality, the sense of being a real home where real people face real problems. When you visit Old Westbury Gardens today, you see a perfectly preserved snapshot of 1920s elegance. The furniture is arranged just so. The gardens are immaculate. Everything looks exactly as it did in old photographs from the estate's prime. But that perfection is an illusion. Real homes are messy. Real gardens have weeds. Real life includes conflict and compromise and imperfection. By preserving Old Westbury Gardens as a museum piece, we've created a fantasy version of the past, one where everything was beautiful and nothing was difficult. We've erased the servant's struggles and the family's anxieties and the constant financial pressure. We've created a theme park version of wealth, sanitized and simplified for public consumption. And this sanitization serves a purpose. It allows visitors to admire the beauty without confronting the cost. It allows us to romanticize the past without grappling with its injustices. It allows us to preserve the symbols of extreme wealth without asking uncomfortable questions about whether that kind of wealth was ever justified, whether it was built on fair labor practices, whether the social structures that enabled it were moral. The preservation of estates like old Westbury Gardens is often presented as culturally neutral, as simply saving beauty and history. But it's not neutral, it's a choice about what history to preserve and whose stories to tell. The human cost of building and maintaining old Westbury Gardens extended far beyond the Phipps family and their servants. The wealth that built the estate came from the steel industry, from Henry Phipps's partnership with Andrew Carnegie, and the steel industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was built on brutal labor conditions. Steel workers labored 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions for low wages. They faced injury and death regularly. They had no job security, no health insurance, no retirement benefits. When they tried to organize unions to improve conditions, they were often met with violence. Henry Phipps was not directly responsible for those conditions in the same way that Carnegie was. Phipps was the financial partner, not the operations manager, but he profited from them. The $50 million he received when the steel company was sold was money generated in part by the exploitation of workers who had no share in the profits they helped create. The connection between the beauty of old Westbury Gardens and the suffering of steel workers in Pennsylvania is not immediately visible, but it's real. The mansion and gardens exist because of the wealth extracted from those workers' labor. This is not unique to the Phipps family. Almost every great estate from the Gilded Age has similar roots. The mansions in Newport, the estates on Long Island's Gold Coast, the grand homes in San Francisco and Chicago. They were all built with fortunes generated by industries that exploited workers, extracted natural resources, and operated with minimal regulation or concern for social consequences. The beauty we preserve today is inseparable from that history. And when we visit these estates, when we admire their gardens and their architecture, we should also remember the workers who made them possible and who received almost nothing in return. If this made you pause, that pause matters. Because understanding the true cost of wealth, not just the financial cost, but the human cost, is essential if we're going to think clearly about inequality, about legacy, about what we choose to preserve and celebrate. The late 20th century brought new challenges to old Westbury Gardens. As Long Island continued to develop, the estate became increasingly surrounded by suburban sprawl. Shopping malls and housing developments crept closer to its borders. Traffic noise increased. The sense of isolation and timelessness that the gardens were designed to create became harder to maintain. The estate that had once been truly remote, truly removed from the modern world, was now just an island of green in a sea of development. This created both practical and philosophical problems. Practically, the noise and light pollution affected the experience of visiting the gardens. Philosophically, it raised questions about what exactly was being preserved. If the estate's value was partly in providing an escape from modern life, what happened when modern life surrounded it on all sides? If the gardens were meant to create a sense of timelessness, what did it mean when you could hear highway traffic from the terraces? The foundation responded by investing heavily in buffers, planting trees and shrubs around the perimeter, building walls and fences, doing everything possible to screen out the surrounding development. But these were expensive band-aids, not permanent solutions. The fundamental reality was that old Westbury Gardens existed now in a completely different context than it had been designed for. It was an artifact from one era trying to survive in another, and the survival required constant adaptation and constant investment. The family members who still had connections to old Westbury Gardens often expressed ambivalence about the estate's transformation into a public institution. On one hand, they were glad it had been preserved, glad that the beauty their grandfather created could be shared with the public. On the other hand, they had lost the private family home where generations had gathered, where memories had been made. The estate was still there, but it was no longer theirs in any meaningful sense. They were visitors now, just like everyone else. They could walk the gardens and tour the mansion, but they couldn't truly inhabit them. The preservation had come at the cost of personal connection. This loss is rarely discussed in the triumphant narratives of historic preservation. We talk about how wonderful it is that these estates have been saved for the public benefit, and that is wonderful. But we rarely acknowledge what the families gave up in the process. We rarely consider whether the descendants of these wealthy families might actually feel a sense of loss, of displacement, of being asked to sacrifice their personal history for the public good. And we rarely ask whether they had any real choice in the matter, or whether financial pressures and tax structures essentially forced them to give up properties they might have preferred to keep private. The psychology of inheritance is complex and often contradictory. Many people who inherit wealth feel guilty about it. They know they didn't earn it. They know they were simply lucky to be born into the right family. They know that having wealth they didn't work for creates questions about their own worth and identity. For some heirs, this guilt leads to philanthropy and to giving away large portions of their inheritance. For others, it leads to a kind of paralysis and his inability to enjoy the wealth or use it purposefully. And for still others, it leads to resentment. Resentment of the expectations that come with inherited wealth, resentment of being defined by their family name rather than their own accomplishments. The Phipps descendants seem to have experienced all of these reactions at different times and in different ways. Some embraced the family legacy and worked to preserve it. Others walked away and built lives independent of the family name. Some gave generously to charitable causes. Others lived quietly, avoiding publicity. There was no single Phipps family response to their inherited wealth because they were individuals with different values, different personalities, different relationships to their family history. But all of them, in one way or another, had to grapple with the question, what does it mean to inherit something you didn't build? What do you owe to the past? And at what point does obligation to preserve a legacy become a burden that prevents you from living your own life? These stories take time, and support keeps them possible. If you're still here, it means you understand that these questions don't have easy answers, that the relationship between wealth and identity, between legacy and freedom, is deeply complicated. And if you believe that exploring these complications matters, that belief is what keeps this work possible. The gardens at Old Westbury remain genuinely spectacular. The foundation has done an admirable job maintaining them to the highest standards. The boxwood hedges are perfectly trimmed. The rose garden blooms in profusion. The lily pond reflects the sky in mirror-perfect stillness. Visitors regularly describe the experience as magical, as stepping into another world, as a respite from the chaos of modern life. And all of that is true. The beauty is real. The craftsmanship and care that go into maintaining these gardens are real, but that beauty comes with a price tag that most visitors never see. The foundation staff includes expert horticulturalists with advanced degrees. The plant materials used are often rare and expensive. The tools and equipment required for professional garden maintenance represent substantial capital investment. The water usage alone is significant in an era of increasing environmental consciousness about water conservation. The pesticides and fertilizers, while used responsibly, still represent chemical intervention in what appears to be a natural landscape. The illusion of effortless natural beauty requires enormous effort and resources to maintain, and this raises deeper questions about what we value and why. Why do we, as a society, invest millions of dollars in preserving one wealthy family's garden, while public parks in many communities are underfunded and poorly maintained? Why is it easier to raise money to preserve historic estates than to create new green spaces in underserved neighborhoods? Why does the beauty created for private wealthy families a century ago receive more protection and resources than the beauty that could be created for everyone today? These aren't questions with simple answers. There are legitimate arguments for historic preservation. Old Westbury Gardens represents craftsmanship and horticultural knowledge that would be lost if the estate were destroyed. It provides aesthetic and educational value to the public. It preserves a piece of history that helps us understand how people lived in another era. All of these points have merit, but they don't eliminate the fundamental inequity in how we allocate resources for beauty, for green space, for public benefit. The current reality of old Westbury Gardens is that it exists in a kind of limbo between past and present. It's preserved as a historical property, but it functions as a modern event venue. It's protected as a nonprofit educational institution, but it generates revenue through weddings and corporate events. It's presented as a piece of living history, but it's actually a carefully managed performance of what history looked like. The estate is simultaneously authentic and artificial, valuable and anachronistic, beautiful and problematic. For visitors who know nothing of the history, who simply come to enjoy the gardens and tour the mansion, these contradictions might not be apparent. They see beauty and they appreciate it. But for those who look deeper, who ask questions about how this beauty came to exist and what was required to maintain it, the experience becomes more complicated. The gardens are still beautiful, but the beauty is shadowed by awareness of cost, financial cost, human cost, opportunity cost. The final years of John Schaffer Phipps's life were marked by a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had succeeded in preserving his father's estate. He had established the foundation that would maintain it for future generations. He had ensured that the beauty his family created would not be lost, but he had also spent his entire adult life in service to that preservation, and there's no evidence that he ever asked himself whether it was worth it, whether the sacrifice of his own ambitions and dreams was justified by the outcome, whether preserving one family's garden was really the best use of a lifetime. He died in 1973, having lived to see Old Westbury Gardens successfully transition to a public institution. The gardens he had tended so carefully continued to bloom. The mansion he had maintained so diligently continued to stand. His father's dream had survived. But at what cost to his own life, his own happiness, his own sense of purpose? We'll never know because he never said. He was a man of his generation, raised to believe that duty came before personal fulfillment, that family obligations outweighed individual desires. He did what was expected of him, and if that left him unfulfilled, if that meant he never pursued his own dreams, well, that was simply the price of being born into a family with a legacy to maintain. His children and grandchildren have largely chosen different paths. They've pursued careers in fields far removed from garden maintenance and historic preservation. They've built lives that are comfortable but not ostentatious. They've quietly stepped back from the spotlight that once shone on their family name. And in doing so, they've implicitly rejected the notion that family legacy should consume individual identity. They've chosen authenticity over performance, personal meaning over public prestige. Whether that represents wisdom or failure depends on your perspective, but it represents a choice, a conscious decision not to be defined entirely by inherited wealth and inherited obligations. Before moving on, ask yourself, if you inherited something beautiful but burdensome, something valuable but all-consuming, would you keep it? Would you sacrifice your own dreams to preserve someone else's vision? Or would you choose to let it go, to pursue your own path, even if that meant being the generation that didn't preserve the family legacy? The morning sun that breaks through the copper beech trees at Old Westbury Gardens today is the same sun that broke through them a century ago. The peacocks still wander the lawns, their calls echoing off the same stone walls. The mansion still glows in the afternoon light. From the outside, almost nothing has changed. The beauty endures, but everything has changed. The private family home has become a public museum. The intimate garden has become a venue for strangers' weddings. The family legacy has been transformed into a nonprofit foundation dependent on donors and admission fees. The dream of permanence, of creating something that would last forever exactly as it was built, has been achieved only by fundamentally altering what was built. The estate survived, but its meaning changed, and that survival came at a cost paid not just in money, but in privacy, in family connection, in the very qualities that made it a home rather than just a property. The Phipps family story is not a simple tale of tragedy or triumph. It's more complicated than that. Henry Phipps achieved remarkable things. He rose from poverty to become one of the richest men in America. He built something genuinely beautiful at Old Westbury Gardens. His son John preserved that beauty against enormous odds. The foundation continues to maintain it today. By one measure, the story is a success. The beauty endured, the legacy survived. But by another measure, the story is profoundly sad. Henry built a monument to his success that became a burden to his descendants. John sacrificed his own life to maintain his father's dream. The servants and workers who made it all possible were forgotten. The estate could only survive by ceasing to be what it was designed to be. The price of preservation was transformation, and the survivors of the family largely walked away, choosing to build lives elsewhere, choosing to let go of a legacy that had demanded too much. These stories take time, and support keeps them possible. If you believe that understanding the true cost of wealth and legacy matters, if you believe that history should include not just the triumphant narratives, but also the hidden costs and the forgotten people, then that belief is what allows this work to continue. Share this story, discuss it with others, ask these difficult questions about what we preserve and why, about whose stories we tell and whose we ignore, about the price of beauty and who really pays it. The philosophical question at the heart of the old Westbury Gardens story is this: what does it mean to build something that outlasts you? Is it a kind of immortality, a way of ensuring that your name and your vision continue after you're gone? Or is it a burden, a demand placed on future generations that they didn't choose and may not want? Is the preservation of beauty always worth the cost? Or are there times when it's better to let things go, to allow change and decay, rather than fighting endlessly to hold back time? There's no single answer because the question itself is complicated by context and perspective. For visitors who come to Old Westbury Gardens and experience joy and inspiration from its beauty, the preservation seems obviously worthwhile. For the workers whose labor maintains that beauty, but whose own stories are forgotten, the equation might look different. For the Phipps descendants who inherited the burden of preservation, the answer likely depends on which family member you ask. For the broader society that could have used the resources spent on preservation for other purposes, the calculation involves trade-offs that are difficult to quantify. What's clear is that the simple narrative that preserving beautiful historic properties is an uncomplicated good is insufficient. The reality is messy. There are costs as well as benefits. There are winners and losers. There are questions about equity and priority and what we owe to the past versus what we owe to the present and future. And wrestling with those questions, refusing to accept easy answers, is essential if we're going to make wise decisions about what to preserve and how to allocate our collective resources. The gardens at Old Westbury remain beautiful. The mansion remains grand. The peacocks still wander the lawns. And every year, hundreds of thousands of people visit and find joy in that beauty. That matters. Beauty matters. History matters. But so do the hidden costs. So do the forgotten workers. So do the descendants who inherited a burden they didn't choose. So do the alternative uses of the resources required to maintain one family's garden. If you're still here, if you've stayed until the end, it's because you understand that these complications don't diminish the beauty. They make it more real. They make it human. They remind us that nothing is simple, that every choice has consequences, that even the most beautiful things come with costs that someone has to pay. The Phipps family built something extraordinary at Old Westbury Gardens. They also paid an extraordinary price, and so did many others whose names we don't even know. Both of those things are true. Both matter, and holding both truths at the same time, refusing to simplify or sanitize, is the only way to really understand what wealth costs and what legacy means. The morning sun still breaks through the copper beech trees, the gardens still bloom, the beauty endures. But now you know what it costs to create and what it costs to maintain. Now you know whose labor made it possible, and whose dreams were sacrificed to preserve it. Now you understand that the question isn't simply whether beauty should be preserved, but at what cost and for whose benefit. That's the question that haunts every preserved estate, every historic garden, every monument to wealth that outlived the people who built it. And if you believe that asking that question matters, that understanding the full story matters, then you know what to do. Share this story, keep asking questions, refuse the simple narratives, because the truth is always more complicated, always more interesting, and always more important than the beautiful illusion.